The weekend box office for January 17th to 20th, which expands to 4 days for Martin Luther King Jr. Day, delivered some surprising results domestically. After Den of Thieves 2 became the #1 movie at the box office in its opening weekend, the film had hopes of still competing for a top 3 spot as Universal's Wolfman reimagining and Keke Palmer's comedy One of Them Days hit theaters. The expectation was that either of the new releases would come out on top of the box office over the traditional 3-day weekend, as well as the extended 4-day weekend. That's what projections called for, and our Wolfman and One of Them Days box office preview reflected this notion. Tracking called for an easy win for Universal's horror monster movie, but the end result was completely different. Wolfman struggled to find an audience, while Den of Thieves 2 had a larger drop than anticipated. This all came as Mufasa, the Lion King's box office barely dropped and One of Them Days came in on the higher end of projections. The weekend box office recap for January 17th to 20th is different than expected. As a result, Mufasa, the Lion King was the #1 movie at the box office this weekend after overtaking One of Them Days. One of Them Days nearly won the 3-day weekend. Droz and Alyssa look shocked in One of Them Days. Thanks to MLK Day factoring into the weekend box office, Mufasa, the Lion King beat One of Them Days to be the #1 movie in the country. This was not fully expected because Disney's The Lion King sequel only had a 15.2% drop in its 5th weekend of release. That's a remarkable hold for Mufasa and gives it its 3rd weekend at the top of box office charts domestically. The strong word of mouth for the film and its recognizable IP have continued to pay dividends still. One of Them Days came very close to winning the box office in its debut weekend. This would have been quite an accomplishment for the Keke Palmer comedy. A true comedic film has not been the #1 movie at the weekend box office in nearly 3 years. Jackass Forever was the last comedy to open at #1 and that was back in February 2022. One of Them Days' record-breaking Rotten Tomatoes score for Palmer and its cinema score shows how much audiences and critics love the film. Its overperformance to the tune of $11.8M, $14M is another sign. Wolfman's poor reception tanks the film's opening weekend box office. Wolfman finished #3 instead of #1. The Wolfman transforms. Universal was expected to be at the top of the weekend box office thanks to Wolfman, but the film proved to have a more middling opening than projections indicated. Instead of having an $18 million plus opening, it only made $10.9 million over 3 days and $12.3 million over 4 days. The saving grace for Universal and Wolfman is the film's reported $25 million budget, meaning the studio could still wind up breaking even at worse on the monster film. This is less of a certainty based on the film's reception though. Wolfman received mixed reviews from critics, with many skewing negative on Rotten Tomatoes. This unfavorable reaction is something audiences have felt, too, as demonstrated by its 57% popcorn meter score and AC cinema score. That puts the production, which Blumhouse was also involved in a position where it could suffer from harsh drops due to the poor word of mouth. Horror movies are usually seen as critic-proof to a certain degree, but those films that still succeed at the box office need audiences to latch on. So far, they have not for Wolfman. Den of Thieves 2 is dropping quicker than the original at the box office. The Den of Thieves sequel is falling behind. Den of Thieves 2 also performed worse than anticipated in its 2nd weekend of release. The film's opening weekend gave signs of hope that Gerard Butler and O'Shea Jackson Jr.'s sequel could be a solid hit for Lionsgate early in 2025. It has better reviews than the original 2018 movie, but audiences are seemingly not as excited to see the sequel in theaters. Den of Thieves 2's $6.6 million 2nd weekend is lower than the original's $8.6 million. The $2 million difference is substantial when talking about a mid-budget action film. Den of Thieves 2 suffered a 56% drop this past weekend, which is far worse than Den of Thieves only dropping 43% in its 2nd frame. After opening $200,000 behind the original, the sequel is now trailing it by $2.6 million after the traditional 2nd weekend. The gap closes to $2.1 million after factoring in the 2nd Monday haul for each film. This is not a great sign for Den of Thieves 2 considering it has been the biggest R-rated action movie in theaters during this stretch, and a major competitor enters the field this coming weekend with Flight Risk. Other takeaways from the 2025 MLK weekend box office. Mufasa continues to perform well for Disney. Mufasa from Mufasa, The Lion King, 2024, in front of a blurred image from the film and a mountain of cash custom image by Louis Glazebrook. For any concerns that Mufasa, The Lion King would be a box office disappointment for Disney, the film has continued to impress after more than a month in theaters. It's now made over $200 million domestically and is close to eclipsing $600 million worldwide. Impressively small drops like Mufasa had this weekend are not likely to keep happening, but it continues to defy conventional norms. It's now stayed in the top 2 at the box office for 5 consecutive weekends, winning 2 of them. That's a massive win for Disney, especially ahead of Snow White continuing the live-action remake trend. It's also worth noting that Moana 2 stays in the top 5 for the weekend over the extended MLK Day period but drops to 6th over the traditional 3-day weekend. This is the first time in 8 weeks of release that the animated sequel fell out of top 5. It's no wonder Moana 2 made $1 billion officially thanks to these strong holds, as this last weekend was its lowest drop, at 9.8%, other than the post-Christmas weekend that saw it increase its weekend-to-weekend haul. Elsewhere, Nosferatu and Baby Girl continue to do well and secure more milestones. Nosferatu has now made over $90 million domestically, putting it on the cusp of being the first Robert Eggers movie to make over $100 million here. Baby Girl also crossed the $25 million box office milestone, which is a first for a Nicole Kidman leading movie in 17 years.